Russian troops in the Pokrovsk direction of Donetsk region will retreat when they see the threat of encirclement. This was reported by Yevgeny Dikiy, the former commander of the Aydar battalion of the Ukrainian army. According to his prediction, the Russians, who are facing the threat of encirclement, will be forced to retreat in the next few days. According to his prediction, the Russians, who are facing the threat of encirclement, will be forced to retreat in the next few days. I still don't think the Russians are stupid enough to stand there until they die, giving our people the opportunity to surround them. I think they will retreat in droves when this threat becomes apparent, Dikiy said. Recently, Kiev's forces had recaptured the village of Pishchane in Donetsk, about 5 kilometers to Pokrovsk south. It isn't so much the result of something collapsing for the Russians or some kind of magical weapon being delivered to Ukraine, no. Certain organizational actions were taken to help Ukrainians act more effectively, Viktor Trihobov, a military spokesman, told. Ukraine has been using drones for deep strikes on Russia in an effort to inflict pain and strengthen its overall position. Russia has continued to conduct regular drone and missile strikes, while making advances on the ground in the east. I would expect a much stronger push. I would expect that we would see a lot of Russian efforts to advance, a NATO official who requested anonymity told Reuters. Though Ukrainian officials are careful to praise Trump, his push to engage directly with the Russians without first consulting with Kiev and to leave out the Europeans entirely is a cause for alarm in Ukraine and Europe. Russian media report an explosion at Raidanez oil field in Tyumen region of Russia. The incident occurred in the evening during repair work on the equipment. According to preliminary data, an unexpected release of a mixture of gas, oil and water to the surface occurred on the territory of the enterprise, which led to a fire. 2 workers who were near the epicenter of the fire received severe burns. This was reported by Bucha. 23 oil wells were shut down after the incident. The victims were 21-year-old Mukam Bashir K and 46-year-old Urabek S, both assistant drillers. After the incident, they were quickly taken to the regional hospital, where doctors assessed their condition as serious. To stabilize the condition of the victims, doctors put them into a drug-induced sleep. Fire crews arrived at the scene promptly and managed to contain the fire. However, the incident has caused the suspension of operations at 23 neighboring wells, which could affect the overall volume of oil production in the region. The exact causes and circumstances of the incident will be determined during the investigation conducted by the relevant authorities. The Raidanez oil field is one of the key objects of the oil-producing industry of the Tyumen region. Such incidents emphasize the need for strict compliance with safety regulations and regular maintenance of equipment to prevent emergency situations.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was visiting Ankara while in Saudi Arabia. US and Russian officials gathered to discuss the war in Ukraine. As the Telegraph writes, it was impossible not to suspect that the Ukrainian president's mood was gloomy and his thoughts were elsewhere. For the first time since the war began in February 2022, Zelensky has found himself on the sidelines, the publication wrote. The publication noted that there were signs that his influence in the West was waning even before Donald Trump's election victory. When the Ukrainian president visited Capitol Hill in September 2024, he had difficulty meeting with influential officials. But this week, his disregard was on full display. As the Ukrainian president climbed the steps of Atatürk's tomb, his country's future was being mapped out in Riyadh, where a US delegation met with the Russians for the first time to discuss ending the war, the newspaper stated. Journalists noted that the first news from the summit suggests that there is a good reason why the Russians and Americans did not invite Zelensky to the discussions. Both delegations agreed to the idea of holding elections in Ukraine before any peace agreement is signed, the publication wrote. The Telegraph stressed that eliminating Zelensky is the main goal of Russian dictator Putin, since no one has done more to thwart the Kremlin's ambitions to enslave Ukraine and break its spirit. The failure of the Russian FSB security services to kill him is considered a disgrace. The best hope, as the Kremlin now believes, is to push for elections, interfere in them in the usual way, and install a pro-Moscow puppet who will sign a humiliating peace deal that Zelensky will surely refuse, the journalists explained the outcome. But this is where attempts to remove Zelensky run into difficulties. It is not as easy for Russia to influence Ukrainian elections now as it was before the war. The majority of the population spits at the mention of Putin's name. Hatred cannot be provoked by disinformation. The most pro-Moscow sections of the Ukrainian population live in Donbass, which is already occupied by the Russians and therefore is not able to take part in the Ukrainian electoral process, the publication stated. In a statement following talks between Russia and the United States in Saudi Arabia, Donald Trump lashed out at the Ukrainian leadership as well as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and said that elections should be held in Ukraine. According to the Financial Times, Trump criticized President Volodymyr Zelensky's handling of the war and said that Ukraine hasn't had an election in a long time. This is not Russia's business. This is something that comes from me and from many other countries. There is a leadership in Ukraine now that has allowed a war to start that should not have happened, he said. As the publication recalls, Zelensky's term in office expired last year, but Ukraine says it will be able to hold elections only after the fighting stops and martial law is lifted. When Trump criticized Zelensky's leadership, he said that the Ukrainian president's approval rating was 4%. A public opinion poll conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology in December showed that 52% of Ukrainians trusted Zelensky.
Three oil tankers in different parts of the Mediterranean have exploded over the past month, the causes of which have not yet been determined, Reuters reported, citing sources in the shipping industry and security services. All three tankers, according to data from ship tracking services, had recently visited Russian ports. As Reuters notes, these are the first cases of explosions on board civilian ships in the Mediterranean Sea in several decades. Thus, the agency recalls, on February 15 in the port of Savona in northern Italy, as a result of an explosion, the tanker Sea Jewel, operated by the Greek company Thenamaris, received damage to the hull 1 meter below the waterline. On the same tanker, 20 minutes later, another explosion occurred, which did not cause damage to the vessel. The Savona prosecutor's office is investigating the circumstances of the incident. The tanker Sea Charm, also operated by Thenamaris, was damaged by an explosion in the Turkish port of Ceyhan in late January, two sources told Reuters. Thenamaris did not immediately respond to the agency's request for comment. The third tanker incident occurred in Libya in February. The Grace Ferrum was so badly damaged that it required a salvage operation, three sources told Reuters. The Grace Ferrum is operated by Cypriot company Simar and flies the Liberian flag. Simar was also unavailable for comment. Shipping industry officials told Reuters they were growing concerned about the series of explosions. The agency recalls that at the end of December, an explosion occurred in the engine room of the Russian dry cargo ship Ursa Major. The dry cargo ship, which had been delivering cargo for the Russian military in Syria for several years, sank, and the fate of 3 crew members is unknown. The owner of the Ursa Major, the Oberon Logistics group of companies, which is part of the Russian Ministry of Defense, announced that a targeted terrorist attack had been carried out on the dry cargo ship. Ukrainska Pravda claimed that the tanker Sejavl is part of Russia's shadow fleet, which transports Russian oil to Europe despite sanctions. The publication also wrote that this tanker recently visited the Turkish port of Ceyhan. The shadow fleet, according to investigators, is used by Russia to transport oil and petroleum products in order to avoid European and American sanctions. It includes several hundred vessels that are not formally connected to Russia.